The galaxy had known peace for 400 years, but it was not the kind of peace anyone celebrated, because it was the peace of fear and silence, and looking away when something terrible moved through the dark between the stars. Every species in the galactic conquered understood one truth above all others, and that truth was simple. The Vraxith were out there, and if you were smart, you stayed out of their way. The Vraxith were nightmares given flesh and purpose and hunger that never ended, and they came from a world called Kandor 9, where everything that lived had evolved to kill everything else. And the Vraxith had won that war 1,000,000 years ago, and then they had looked up at the stars and decided to win that war too. They stood 9 feet tall on 8 limbs that ended in claws that could tear through starship hull plating, and their bodies were covered in bioceramic chitin harder than most armor, and they could survive in hard vacuum for several minutes, and their minds were linked together in a hive intelligence that made them fight as one terrible organism. And when they came for you, there was no bargaining and no surrender and no mercy, because those were concepts they had never evolved to understand. 400 years ago, during the time, the galaxy now called the Bleeding Century, the Vraxith had swept across the outer rim and devoured colony after colony, and it had taken 14 species, sacrificing their entire fleets in a final desperate stand to push them back. And even then nobody was sure if the Vraxith had truly been defeated, or if they had simply grown bored and returned to their dark corner of space to wait. Now they were back. The emergency session of the Galactic Concord was held aboard Ascendancy Prime, the massive orbital station that hung above the neutral world of Vraxith and served as the seat of galactic governance. And inside the great circular chamber, where 31 species sent their ambassadors, the air was thick with fear that everyone could taste, but nobody wanted to name. Ambassador Sethara Ko stood at the central podium, and she was trembling, but her voice was clear, and it carried to every corner of that enormous room. She was Thili, a species that the rest of the galaxy often described as gentle, which was a kind way of saying they had almost no military capability, and had never needed any because they were farmers and scholars and poets who had been gifted a cluster of fertile worlds on the outer rim where they grew food that fed half the conquered. "A Vraxith grand swarm has entered our border region," she said, and her 4 eyes blinked in a pattern that meant she was fighting to stay composed. "They have already sent scout ships to 3 of our colony worlds, and we have received no communication from them because the Vraxith do not communicate, and they do not negotiate, and you all know what comes next." She paused and looked around the chamber at the faces and forms and sensory organs of 30 species, who owed their survival in part to Thili grain shipments. "We are asking for help," she said simply. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Sethara had ever heard. It was not that they did not care, because many of them did care, and some of them cared deeply, and Ambassador Keth of the Drenathi actually lowered his great horned head in what his species used as a gesture of genuine sorrow. But caring was not the same as committing warships and soldiers to fight something that had nearly destroyed the galaxy the last time anyone tried. High Marshal Drennick Vor of the Kalosi was the first to speak, and the Kalosi were a proud martial species with powerful fleets and a warrior culture that stretched back thousands of years. And if anyone in the Conquered was going to stand and fight, it should have been them. "Ambassador Ko," he said, and his voice was deep and resonant and heavy with something that sounded almost like shame. "I have run the projections with my war council, and I must be honest with you because you deserve honesty even when it is painful." He stood, and his tall armored frame cast a shadow across the chamber floor. "If I commit my entire fleet, every ship, every soldier, every weapon we possess, we could delay the grand swarm by perhaps 3 weeks, and at the end of those 3 weeks my fleet would be destroyed, and the swarm would continue forward as if we had never existed, and your worlds would still burn, but my worlds would burn after them." He sat down heavily. "I am sorry," he said. "The mathematics of fighting the Vraxith have not changed in 400 years." One by one, The other ambassadors spoke, and their words were different but their meaning was the same. "We are sorry and we are afraid and we cannot help you." Sethara Ko stood at that podium and received each refusal with dignity that cost her more than anyone in that room would ever understand. And when the last ambassador had spoken, she simply nodded and said, "I understand," and stepped down. In a small analysis room 3 levels below the main chamber, a junior intelligence analyst named Riven was doing what they always did, which was monitoring the galaxy's electromagnetic noise for anomalies and patterns and things that did not fit. Riven was Selthari, a small quiet species known for patience and pattern recognition, and an almost obsessive attention to detail, and they had been assigned to the Conquered Signals Intelligence Division, because they were very good at finding needles in cosmic haystacks. On this particular day, while the ambassadors above argued about whether the Thili could be evacuated in time, Riven found something strange. It was a signal coming from an uncharted system on the far edge of the outer rim, a region so remote that nobody had bothered to survey it properly, and the signal was not a distress call, and it was not a military transmission, and it was not any kind of communication that matched known galactic protocols. It was music. Someone out there was broadcasting music into the void, complex layered audio with rhythm and melody, and something that Riven could only describe as emotion made into sound, and it was coming from the third planet of a small yellow star that was not in any Conquered database. Riven flagged the signal and submitted a report to their supervisor, who glanced at it and said, "Interesting but not relevant to the current crisis," and filed it away, and Riven went back to their work, but they kept one ear tuned to that strange, beautiful signal from the edge of nowhere. 3 days later, the Vraxith vanguard arrived at Asharon, the largest and most populated of the Thili colony worlds. Sethara Ko was there because she had refused the last evacuation shuttle and told the pilot to give her seat to someone with children, and she stood on the landing platform of the capital city and watched the sky darken with drop pods that fell like black rain. The evacuation ships were still loading, thousands of Thili pressing against each other in desperate lines, trying to reach the transports, and the sound they made was not screaming exactly, because the Thili did not scream the way other species did, but it was a low, keening hum that vibrated in the bones, and it was the sound of a people who understood that they were about to die. The first Vraxith warriors hit the ground running, and they did not pause, and they did not hesitate, and they moved through the outer districts of the city like a flood of chitin and claws, and the sounds that followed were the sounds the galaxy had spent 400 years trying to forget. Sethara watched from the platform, and she did not run because there was nowhere left to run to, and she thought about her people and their gentle world, and the crops they would never harvest, and the poems they would never write, and she wondered if anyone out there in the vast cold galaxy would even remember the Thili after they were gone. She did not know that, at that very moment, a ship crewed by a species she had never heard of was picking up her world's distress signal, and that inside that ship, a man named Jonah Mwangi was about to make a decision that would change the shape of the galaxy forever. She did not know that help was coming from the last place anyone would have thought to look. She only knew that the monsters were here, and the sky was falling, and the galaxy had looked away. The United Earth naval ship Perseverance was 3 months into a deep space exploration mission when the signal arrived, and it came through the communication array like a knife through silk, raw and desperate, and full of a terror that needed no translation. Captain Jonah Mwangi stood on the bridge of his ship and listened to it, and he did not understand the language, but he understood the meaning, because some things are universal and fear is one of them, and the plea for help is another. He was a tall man with dark skin and calm eyes, and a voice that made people trust him even when he was telling them things they did not want to hear. And he had spent 20 years in the United Earth Navy, not as a warrior, but as an explorer because humanity had finally built ships that could cross the vast distances between stars, and they had sent them out looking for what they had always hoped to find: proof that they were not alone. This was not how first contact was supposed to happen. "Can we trace the source?" he asked his communications officer, Lieutenant Park, who was already working the signal through every filter and translator the ship carried. "It is coming from a system about 6 days away at maximum speed," Park said. "Multiple sources, and they are all broadcasting the same type of signal. And Captain, I'm also picking up weapons fire and energy signatures consistent with large-scale orbital bombardment." Mwangi looked at his bridge crew, and they looked back at him, and he could see the same thought in every pair of eyes. Someone out there was dying and asking for help, and they were the only ones close enough to hear. The problem was simple and terrible at the same time, because the Perseverance was an exploration vessel, and not a warship, and it carried a crew of 200, including a platoon of 30 Earth Marines under Sergeant Elena Vasquez, who were embarked as a security detachment for exactly the kind of situation nobody had actually expected to encounter. Mwangi could follow protocol and report the signal to Earth Command and wait for instructions, but Earth Command was months away at light-speed communication, and by the time they answered, whoever was screaming would have stopped screaming a long time ago. He made his decision in less than a minute. "Set course for the signal source at maximum speed," he said, "and wake up Sergeant Vasquez." Sergeant Elena Vasquez was 34 years old, and she had grown up in a mountain town in Colombia where the air was thin and the people were tough, and she had joined the Marines at 18 because she wanted to see the stars, and because she was very good at keeping people alive in situations where dying was the easier option. When Mwangi briefed her on the situation, she listened without interruption, and then she asked one question. "How many civilians?" "We do not know," Mwangi said. "The signal suggests a large population center under attack by an unknown hostile force." Vasquez nodded once and went to prep her platoon, and she did not ask what they were flying into because it did not matter. There were people in trouble, and she had Marines, and that was enough. 6 days later, the Perseverance dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the Asharon system, and what they saw through the viewport stole the words from every throat on that bridge. The planet below was burning, and not in the way a planet burns when a volcano erupts or a forest catches fire, but in the way a planet burns when something is killing it on purpose, and the flames were visible from orbit, long angry scars across the surface where cities had been. "My God," someone whispered. Mwangi gripped the railing in front of him, and his knuckles went pale, but his voice stayed level, because that was his job, to stay level when everything else was falling apart. "Launch the Marines," he said. 30 minutes later, 3 drop shuttles punched through the atmosphere of Asharon and dove toward the largest concentration of life signs, which turned out to be the remains of the capital city, where thousands of Thili civilians were trapped in a collapsed underground shelter, with Vraxith warriors closing in from every direction. Vasquez was in the first shuttle, and she saw the aliens for the first time through the shuttle window as they came in low and fast. The tall, gentle figures with 4 eyes who were huddled together in terror, and the nightmare shapes that were moving toward them with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to go. The shuttle doors opened, and Vasquez and her Marines hit the ground running. The Thili who saw them first did not understand what they were looking at because these creatures were small, barely 6 feet tall, and they had soft skin with no armor and no claws and no venom, and 2 eyes and flat teeth, and by every measure that the galaxy used to judge a species' ability to survive, they should have been prey and nothing more. And then the small soft creatures raised their weapons and charged directly at the Vraxith. Not away from them, but toward them. Sethara Ko was inside the collapsed shelter, trying to keep 300 terrified civilians calm when she heard the sound. a rapid sharp cracking that she would later learn was the sound of human gunfire, and then shouting in a language she had never heard, and then an explosion that shook dust from the ceiling. The shelter door was forced open, and standing in the gap was a creature Sethara had never seen before, compact and covered in green fabric and breathing hard and bleeding from a cut above one eye, and holding a weapon that was still smoking. The creature looked at the hundreds of Thili staring back at it with 800 terrified eyes, and it did something that made no sense at all. It smiled. "Come on," Vasquez said, knowing they could not understand her words, but hoping they could understand her meaning. "We are getting you out of here." On Ascendancy, Prime Riven was monitoring the intelligence feeds when the first combat footage arrived from Asharon, relayed by a Thili emergency satellite that was still functioning, and they watched with growing disbelief as the unknown species engaged the Vraxith in direct ground combat. The Vraxith warrior that met the first squad of Marines was 8 feet of armored killing machine, and it moved with the fluid, terrible grace of something that had been perfecting murder for 1,000,000 years, and it struck with its forward claws and caught a Marine across the chest, and the Marine went down hard and did not get up. And the other Marines did not run. They adjusted their fire and concentrated their weapons on the joints between the chitin plates, and one of them pulled a grenade and threw it with a precision that spoke of long practice, and the Vraxith warrior staggered, and the Marines pressed forward, and they were screaming, not in fear but in fury, and they brought it down. Riven watched this small, soft, fragile species fight the most terrifying predator the galaxy had ever known, and they felt something they had not felt in a very long time. They felt hope. Back on the surface, Vasquez led the Thili civilians through the burning streets toward the extraction point, and her Marines formed a perimeter around the column of refugees, and they fought for every block, and they lost 2 more soldiers in the crossing, and Vasquez felt each death like a hammer blow to her chest. But she kept moving because that was what you did. You kept moving, and you kept fighting, and you kept the people behind you alive for 1 more minute, and then 1 more after that. A Thili elder stumbled and fell, and before any of their own people could reach them, a Marine named Cooper scooped the elder up and carried them on his back while firing his rifle one-handed, and he did not slow down, and he did not complain. And when they finally reached the shuttles, Cooper set the elder down gently and then sat against a wall and started shaking, because the fear he had been holding back finally caught up with him. Sethara watched all of this, and she did not understand these creatures, but she understood one thing about them with absolute clarity. They were afraid, and they had come anyway. On the bridge of the Perseverance, Captain Mwangi received a transmission from Sethara, who had managed to access a communication device, and with the help of the ship's translation software, they had their first real conversation between human and alien. "Why are you here?" Sethara asked. "You do not know us, and you owe us nothing, and your people are dying down there, so why did you come?" Mwangi was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Because you asked for help." Sethara stared at the screen, and her 4 eyes blinked in a pattern that meant she was trying very hard not to cry. "That is all?" she asked. "That is the only reason?" "That is the only reason we have ever needed," Mwangi said. On the Conquered intelligence feed that Riven was still monitoring, the footage of the humans fighting on Asharon was now being watched by every analyst and ambassador and military commander on the station, and the question on every mind was not who are they or where did they come from. The question was, why are they not running? The news spread through the Galactic Conquered the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast and hot, and impossible to contain, and within hours of the first combat footage, every species on Ascendancy Prime was talking about the strange new creatures from the edge of nowhere who had done what no one else would do. Riven had not slept in 2 days. The junior analyst had gone from being a nobody buried in a signals intelligence office to being the single most important person on the station, because they were the one who had first found the human signal, and now every ambassador and admiral and intelligence chief wanted Riven in front of them, explaining what they knew about this species that had dropped out of the sky, and started fighting the Vraxith like it was something they did before breakfast. The problem was that Riven did not know very much, but they were very good at finding information, and the humans had been broadcasting into space for over a century, which meant there was an enormous amount of data to work through. Radio signals and television transmissions, and music and literature and news broadcasts, and all of it painted a picture that was deeply confusing to everyone who looked at it. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," said Ambassador Keth of the Drenathi during an emergency intelligence briefing. "You are telling us that this species has spent the majority of its existence at war with itself." "That is correct," Riven said, pulling up a timeline they had assembled from human broadcast data. "In just the last 300 years of their recorded history, they have fought hundreds of wars against members of their own species, including 2 conflicts that engulfed their entire planet and killed tens of millions of their own kind." The chamber went very quiet. "They fought wars that killed millions of their own people," Keth repeated slowly, as if saying it again might make it make more sense, "and they survived." "They did more than survive," Riven said. "After each war they rebuilt, and then they advanced their technology, and then they went back to fighting again, but also, and this is the part I find most confusing, they simultaneously created extraordinary art and music and literature and science, and they sent members of their own species to their moon, and they cured diseases that had killed millions, and they built networks of information that connected every individual on their planet. And they did all of this while also fighting each other constantly." High Marshal Drennick Vor leaned forward in his seat, and his expression was impossible to read. "Show me their military history," he said. Riven did, and for the next hour the assembled leaders of the Galactic Concord watched a presentation on human warfare that left several of them physically ill, and others frozen in something between terror and awe. They saw siege warfare and trench warfare and aerial bombardment, and nuclear weapons and guerrilla tactics, and naval battles and special operations, and the sheer variety of ways humans had invented to kill each other was staggering, because most species in the Concord had 1 or 2 forms of warfare that they had developed and refined, and humans had dozens, and they were all effective, and they all reflected the same underlying truth. This was a species that had been practicing war for its entire existence, and had gotten very, very good at it. "But here is what I find most remarkable," Riven said, and they pulled up a different set of data. After every war they also built hospitals and schools, and they created organizations dedicated to preventing future wars, and they sent aid to their former enemies, and they adopted the children of the people they had been trying to kill the year before. And I do not understand how both of these things can be true at the same time, but they are. Meanwhile, on the surface of Asharon, the battle was continuing, and it was the worst kind of battle, the kind where you fight for every room in every building and every street and every meter of ground, and the cost is paid in blood. Sergeant Vasquez had lost 6 Marines in the first 48 hours, and each one was a wound that would never fully heal. But she did not have time to grieve because the Vraxith were still coming, and the Thili evacuation was still ongoing, and there were still civilians trapped in pockets throughout the city who needed to be reached. The Vraxith were terrifying opponents, and Vasquez would never pretend otherwise, because their chitin armor turned aside standard rifle rounds, and they were faster than anything that big had a right to be. And their Hive intelligence meant they coordinated without communication, and they learned from every engagement. But humans learned faster. Within the first day, Vasquez and her Marines had figured out that the joints between the chitin plates were vulnerable to concentrated fire, and by the second day, they had developed a tactic where 2 Marines would draw a Vraxith warrior's attention, while a third flanked it, and targeted the nerve cluster at the base of the skull. And by the third day, they were building improvised explosive devices from salvaged materials and setting traps in buildings they knew the Vraxith would advance through. They were 30 Marines against a vanguard force of thousands, and they could not win this fight, and they knew it, but winning was not the mission. The mission was buying time and keeping civilians alive, and that was a mission they understood in their bones, because it was what humans had always done when the situation was impossible. They held the line and they bled for it, and they did not stop. On the Perseverance, Captain Mwangi coordinated the evacuation from orbit, and he worked with Sethara Ko through the translation software, and together they organized refugee convoys and identified safe corridors, and prioritized the most vulnerable populations, and Mwangi was calm and methodical, and patient even when the news from the surface was nothing but death and fire. Sethara asked him the question that she could not stop thinking about. Your soldiers are dying down there, and you must know that you cannot defeat the Vraxith with 30 warriors. So why have you not retreated? Because any rational commander would have retreated by now. Mwangi looked at her through the screen, and his dark eyes were tired and sad, and absolutely certain. Because you have not been evacuated yet, he said. Sethara did not know how to respond to that because, in 400 years of galactic politics, she had never encountered a species that considered the survival of strangers to be a reason to die, and she wondered if the translator was malfunctioning, but she looked at his face, and she knew it was not. Back on Ascendancy, Prime Riven was presenting their most significant finding to a closed session of the Concord's senior military commanders. I have been studying the evolutionary history of the human species, Riven said, and I believe I understand why they are able to do what they are doing on Asharon. They brought up a display showing the planet the humans called Earth. This is a death world, Riven said, and a murmur went through the room because death worlds were rare and feared, planets where the environment was so hostile that any species that evolved there was forged in violence. Their planet has extreme temperature variations and tectonic instability and predators on every continent and diseases that mutate fast enough to overcome their immune systems and natural disasters that can destroy entire cities, and the humans evolved in the middle of all of this without natural armor, and without claws, and without venom, and without speed, and without any of the things that most species use to survive. Then how did they survive at all? Drennick Vor asked. They did something that no other species in our records has ever done, Riven said. Instead of evolving to avoid their predators, they hunted their predators to extinction. The room went dead silent. They are persistence predators, Riven continued. They cannot outrun their prey, but they can outlast it because they have a cooling system based on fluid excretion that allows them to maintain physical activity long after other organisms have collapsed from heat exhaustion, and they tracked their prey for days, sometimes weeks, never stopping, never resting long enough for the prey to recover until it simply fell down and could not get up again. Riven paused to let that sink in. Every large predator on their planet is now either extinct or exists only because the humans have chosen to allow it, and they accomplish this not through superior physical ability, but through cooperation and tool use, and a psychological characteristic that I can only describe as an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Drennick Vor was staring at the display, and his expression had changed from curiosity to something much deeper and much more complicated. We evolved to hide from our predators, he said quietly. The Drenathi evolved to outrun theirs, and the Thili evolved to be beneath the notice of theirs, and every species in this Concord survived by avoiding the things that hunted them. He looked at Riven. And the humans survived by hunting the things that hunted them. Yes, Riven said. Drennick Vor stood, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said something that would be remembered for generations. We feared the wrong monsters. At that moment on the surface of Asharon, a Concord surveillance satellite captured an image that would become the most famous photograph in galactic history. It showed a human Marine, later identified as Corporal Davy Santos, carrying a wounded Thili child through a street filled with smoke and rubble and Vraxith bodies, and Santos was bleeding from wounds on his arms and legs, and he was firing his sidearm with one hand while cradling the child against his chest with the other, and his face was twisted with pain and fear, and something else that the Thili had no word for but that humans called determination. Drennick Vor saw that image and he went to his quarters, and sat alone for a very long time. Then he opened a channel to the Kalosi homeworld, and said 4 words that changed everything. Mobilize the war fleet. Far away on the other side of Human Space Earth Command, finally received Captain Mwanga's original transmission, and the admirals and generals watched the footage from Asharon, and they listened to Mwanga's report, and they did not send a recall order. They sent a fleet. The United Earth Expeditionary Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the edge of the Thili border region, and the sensor arrays of every conquered observation post in the area lit up like festival lights, because 40 warships had just appeared where there had been nothing a moment before. These were not exploration vessels like the Perseverance. These were warships built by a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the science of killing, and then had spent another century figuring out how to do it in space, and they bristled with weapons that the conquered had no names for because nobody in the galaxy had ever thought to strap a nuclear warhead to a kinetic impactor and fire it at relativistic speeds, because that was insane, and the humans had done it anyway. At the center of the fleet was the flagship, the UENS Thermopylae, and on its bridge stood Admiral Keed Tanaka, who was a small woman with silver-streaked black hair and a calm, quiet manner that made people forget. She had spent 30 years commanding warships and had never lost an engagement. Tanaka opened a channel to Ascendancy Prime, and the face that appeared on the screens of the Galactic Concord was not what they expected, because they had seen the Marines on Asharon fierce and loud and covered in blood and fury. And this woman looked like she might offer you tea and ask about your family. "This is Admiral Keed Tanaka of the United Earth Navy," she said. "I am contacting the Galactic Concord to formally introduce humanity, and to inform you that we are aware of the Vraxith aggression against the Thili people, and we consider the deliberate targeting of civilian populations to be an act of unconscionable violence that we will not permit to continue." She paused, and her dark eyes were steady and clear. "We are not asking for permission," she said. "We are extending the courtesy of informing you of our intentions, and our intention is to stop the Vraxith by whatever means are necessary. And if any member of the Conquered wishes to stand with us, they are welcome, but we will proceed regardless." The transmission ended, and the Conquered chamber erupted into chaos, because nobody had ever spoken to them like that before. Not with hostility, but with a calm, absolute certainty that did not leave room for debate. High Marshal Drennick Vor, who had already mobilized the Kalosi war fleet, watched the transmission and smiled for the first time in weeks. The first fleet engagement happened 2 days later, when a Vraxith attack group of 60 ships moved to intercept the human fleet, and the conquered military analysts settled in to watch, because they wanted to understand how humans fought in space, and what they saw made several of them request transfers to less stressful positions. Human warships fought wrong. Every species in the Conquered understood space combat as a game of distance, because space was vast, and energy weapons lost coherence over range, and missiles could be intercepted, and the smart play was always to stay far from your enemy and wear them down with precise long-range fire. The humans closed to what the Kalosi called suicide range, and then they kept going. Tanaka's fleet drove straight into the Vraxith formation like a fist through glass, and at close range, the human weapons were devastating, because nuclear-tipped kinetic impactors did not care about Vraxith armor, and directed energy weapons at point-blank range cut through chitin hulls like heat through ice. And the humans used their ships the way their Marines used their bodies, aggressively and creatively, and with a complete disregard for what the enemy expected them to do. The Vraxith attack group was destroyed in 11 minutes, and the human fleet lost 3 ships, and Tanaka did not pause to mourn them because there would be time for mourning later, and right now there were people to save. On the ground, the war changed overnight. Human reinforcements poured onto Asharon and the other besieged Thili colonies. Not just Marines, but heavy armor units and combat engineers and air support and field medics. And with them came something that the Vraxith had never encountered before. Logistics. The Vraxith fought as a swarm driven by instinct and hive intelligence, and they were terrifyingly effective at the level of individual combat. But they had no supply chains and no communication networks and no coordinated command structure that operated above the level of the local hive cluster. The humans brought all of these things, and they connected them together into an integrated system that turned their entire military presence into a single coordinated organism that could respond to threats anywhere on the planet within minutes. And the Vraxith had never fought anything like this, because nothing like this had ever existed in the galaxy before. Sergeant Vasquez, who had been fighting for weeks with almost no support and had held her sector through sheer stubborn refusal to die, suddenly found herself with reinforcements and resupply and air cover, and she stood in the middle of a forward operating base that had been built in 6 hours, and she looked at the fresh Marines and the armored vehicles and the medical tents, and she sat down on an ammunition crate and cried. Not from sadness, but from relief, because she had been carrying the weight of an impossible mission on her shoulders, and she was so tired that her bones ached, and now finally she did not have to carry it alone. Sethara Ko worked alongside the humans in the weeks that followed, and she watched them closely because she was trying to understand them, and what she found confused her more than anything Riven's data had revealed. They were not fearless. She saw Vasquez's hands shake after a firefight, and she saw soldiers sit alone in corners staring at nothing, and she heard them cry at night for the friends they had lost, and she watched a young Marine named Tors freeze completely during an ambush, just stop and stand there trembling while the world exploded around him. And she watched another Marine grab Tors and pull him to cover and hold him until the shaking stopped, and then Tors picked up his weapon and went back into the fight. "You are afraid," Sethara said to Vasquez one evening when the fighting had paused, and they were sitting on the steps of what had once been a Thili school. "Terrified," Vasquez said without hesitation, "every single day." "Then why do you keep fighting?" "Because, in my experience, when a person is afraid they run, and this is sensible and rational, and I do not understand why you do not do this." Vasquez was quiet for a moment, and she looked at the sky where human warships were visible, as points of light moving among the stars. "Because running would mean leaving you here," she said, "and I cannot do that, and it is not because I am brave, because I am not particularly brave, and it is not because I am not afraid, because I am very afraid, but there are things that matter more than being afraid, and you matter more than my fear." Sethara stared at her for a long time. "I do not think you understand how unusual you are," she said. "We are not unusual," Vasquez said. "This is just what humans do." Deep in the void, the Vraxith Hive intelligence was processing something it had never processed before, and it did not like what it was finding. The Hive intelligence was not a single mind, but a vast network of interconnected consciousnesses that had evolved over millions of years, and it had fought and consumed hundreds of species across the galaxy, and it had always won because it understood predator and prey, and these were the only 2 categories that existed in its worldview. The new creatures were not prey because prey ran and these creatures did not run, and the new creatures were not predators because predators hunted for food or territory, and these creatures were fighting to protect members of a different species, which made no evolutionary sense whatsoever. For the first time in its recorded history, the Hive intelligence issued a strategic reassessment, and the conclusion was unsettling. It could not classify the new creatures, and what it could not classify it could not predict, and what it could not predict it could not defeat. Back on Ascendancy, Prime Drenic Vor stood before the full Galactic Concord, and he was angry, and he did not try to hide it. "I am ashamed," he said, and his deep voice echoed through the chamber. "I am ashamed of myself, and I am ashamed of this body, and I am ashamed of every one of us who sat in this room, and told Ambassador Ko that we could not help her because the mathematics did not work." He pointed at the main display, where footage showed human soldiers fighting and dying alongside Thili civilians. Those creatures out there came from the other side of the galaxy, and they had never met the Thili before, and they had no obligation to help, and they came anyway, and they are dying anyway, and we sat here and talked about mathematics. He turned and looked at each ambassador in turn. "I have already committed the Kalosi fleet, and we are moving to support the human forces, but I am not here to inform you of my decision. I am here to ask you what kind of galaxy you want to live in, because if we let strangers die for our neighbors while we hide behind our borders, then we do not deserve the peace we have been hiding behind." The chamber was silent, and then Ambassador Keth of the Drenathi stood. "The Drenathi fleet will join the Kalosi," he said. One by one other ambassadors rose, and the coalition grew, and it was not because they believed they could win. It was because the humans had shown them something they had forgotten. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. Admiral Tanaka received word of the coalition forming, and she smiled, a small tight smile that her crew had learned to recognize as the expression she wore when a plan was coming together. She opened a channel that broadcast on every frequency the Vraxith were known to monitor, and she spoke directly to the Hive intelligence. "We know what you are," she said. "You have not yet learned what we are, and you will." The combined human-conquered fleet assembled in the space above the Thili homeworld, and it was the largest gathering of warships the galaxy had seen since the Bleeding Century. Human dreadnoughts flying alongside Kalosi battle cruisers and Drenathi carrier groups and ships from a dozen other species, who had decided that today was the day they stopped being afraid. Admiral Tanaka stood on the bridge of the Thermopylae and studied the tactical display, and what it showed her was not encouraging, because the Vraxith Grand Swarm outnumbered them 3-1, and the swarm was moving in a formation that the Hive intelligence had perfected over 1,000,000 years of interstellar predation. A closing spiral that would surround the defending fleet and crush it from every direction at once. By every historical model, this should have been a massacre, and Tanaka knew it, and her fleet commanders knew it, and the conquered allies knew it. But humans had a long and complicated relationship with historical models that said they should lose. "All ships," Tanaka said over the fleet-wide channel. "This is Admiral Tanaka, and I am not going to give you a speech about glory or destiny, because that is not what this is about, and you all know what this is about. There are people on that planet who will die if we fail, and we are not going to fail." She paused. "Execute Battle Plan Omega, and give them everything we have." The battle that followed would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries, and the reason it would be studied was not because of its scale, though it was enormous, but because of what it revealed about the difference between a swarm and a team. The Vraxith fought as a hive, and their coordination was seamless, and their individual warriors were devastating, and their ships moved in perfect synchronization, guided by the Hive intelligence that processed information faster than any computer the Conquered had ever built. The humans fought as a team, and the difference was everything. A swarm follows a pattern, and the pattern is dictated from above, and every unit does exactly what it is told, and this makes a swarm fast and efficient and predictable. A team is made up of individuals who understand the plan and the purpose, and who can adapt and improvise and make decisions on their own when the plan falls apart, and the plan always falls apart. Tanaka's fleet broke into wolfpack formations, small groups of ships that operated independently but in service of the larger strategy. and each Wolfpack commander had the authority to make tactical decisions in real time, and the Vraxith could not predict them because there was no single pattern to predict. The human Wolfpacks hit the Vraxith flanks and disappeared and hit them again somewhere else, and the conquered ships, following the human tactical doctrine they had been briefed on, held the center and drew the swarm's attention while the humans tore at its edges. The Kelosi fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves, because something had changed inside them, and it had changed because of the humans, and Drennick Vor led his fleet from the front. And when a Vraxith dreadnought bore down on a damaged Thili transport, he threw his flagship into its path and traded broadsides at a range, so close the two ships nearly touched. He was afraid, and he fought anyway, because a small human woman had taught him that this was what courage looked like. The battle raged for hours, and the losses were terrible on both sides, and the void filled with debris and fire, and the silent screams of breaking ships. But the tide was turning, because the Vraxith had never fought an enemy that adapted faster than they could, and the human Wolfpacks were learning with every engagement, finding weaknesses in the swarm's patterns, and exploiting them before the Hive intelligence could adjust. On the ground, the final battle was even more brutal. Lieutenant Elena Vasquez, field promoted from sergeant after 2 weeks of combat that had killed every officer above her, led a joint human Kelosi strike team on a mission that everyone knew was probably a one-way trip. The target was the Vraxith Hive Nexus, the central node of the Hive intelligence on the planet's surface, a massive organic structure that pulsed with the collective consciousness of every Vraxith in the system, and if they could destroy it, the swarm would lose its coordination and fragment into individual Hive clusters that could be defeated in detail. The strike team numbered 200, 100 humans and 100 Kelosi, and they fought their way through the Vraxith perimeter in a running battle that covered 12 kilometers of devastated terrain, and the fighting was apocalyptic, and there is no other word for it. The Kelosi were formidable warriors, 7 feet tall and naturally armored and trained from birth in the art of combat, and they had always considered themselves the finest soldiers in the galaxy. But what they saw the humans do that day changed their understanding of what a living creature could endure. A Marine named Rodriguez took a Vraxith claw through his shoulder and kept firing with his other arm, and when that arm was broken, he drew his sidearm with the hand that still worked and kept advancing. And when Kelosi warriors tried to pull him back, he shook them off and said, "Not yet," and he made it another 200 meters before his body finally gave out. A combat medic named Akafer ran into a crossfire to drag a wounded Kelosi warrior to cover, and she was hit twice on the way in, and once on the way out, and she treated the Kelosi warrior's injuries before she treated her own. And when the Kelosi warrior looked at her with an expression that could only be described as disbelief, she just said, "You are welcome," and went to find the next wounded. Vasquez herself fought at the front, and she was not the strongest or the fastest, but she was the one who kept going when everyone else wanted to stop. And she rallied the strike team 3 times when they faltered, and each time she did it not with grand words, but with the simple act of standing up when every nerve in her body was begging her to stay down. They reached the Hive Nexus, and it was enormous, a tower of living tissue that reached toward the sky and hummed with a frequency that made everyone's teeth ache. And Vasquez ordered the charges set, and the demolition team went to work, while the rest of the strike team held the perimeter against a Vraxith counterattack that came from every direction at once. In space, the Hive intelligence felt the threat to its nexus, and it did something it had never done before. It reached out with its collective consciousness and tried to touch the mind of the enemy commander. Admiral Tanaka was on the bridge when she felt it, a pressure behind her eyes, and then a flood of images and sensations that the Hive intelligence used as weapons against the minds of other species. Darkness and death and the void, and the cold certainty that everything ends and nothing matters and resistance is meaningless, because the Vraxith are eternal and all other things are food. Tanaka gripped the arms of her command chair and closed her eyes, and she let the images wash over her, and she did not fight them because she recognized them. She had seen darkness before. She had lost her parents in a colony accident when she was 12, and she had buried friends in 3 different wars, and she had held the hand of her dying mentor and watched the light leave his eyes, and she knew what the void looked like, because every human carried their dead with them. The Hive intelligence pushed harder, projecting annihilation and extinction and the absolute futility of resistance. And Tanaka opened her eyes, and her voice was quiet and steady when she spoke. "We already know," she said. "We have always known that everything ends and we fight anyway, and that is the thing you will never understand about us. We do not fight because we think we will live forever. We fight because the people we love are standing behind us, and they need one more day." The Hive intelligence recoiled, because for the first time in its existence, it had encountered a mind that did not break under the weight of fear. Not because the mind was stronger, but because it had already carried that weight every single day and had learned to walk with it. On the ground, Vasquez gave the order and the charges detonated, and the Hive Nexus came apart in a column of fire and light that could be seen from orbit. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Vraxith, because the swarm fragmented, and the seamless coordination that had made them the galaxy's ultimate predators shattered into 1,000 confused and directionless clusters, and the combined human-conquered fleet fell on them with everything they had. The Vraxith Grand Swarm broke. Not a tactical withdrawal and not a strategic repositioning, but a rout, a genuine panicked flight into the dark between the stars. And it was the first time in galactic history that a Vraxith force had turned and run from anything. The battle was over. In the days that followed, the galaxy tried to make sense of what had happened, and the diplomats and historians and analysts would spend years writing about it, but the simple truth was this. The monsters had met something they did not understand and could not classify and could not predict, and for the first time the monsters had been afraid. Sethara Ko stood before the full galactic conquered, and her voice did not tremble anymore, because she had walked through fire with humans, and it had burned the trembling out of her. "I move to formally sponsor the admission of the human species to the galactic conquered," she said, "and I will tell you why. We spent 400 years fearing the monsters in the dark, and we built our entire civilization around that fear, and we told ourselves that fear was wisdom, and that hiding was survival, and we were wrong." She paused and looked around the chamber. "We did not need bigger ships or stronger armor or more powerful weapons, and what we needed was someone to remind us that courage is not a weakness and compassion is not foolishness, and that the willingness to stand between the helpless and the darkness is the only thing that has ever made civilization worth building." She took a breath. "We feared the monsters in the dark, and then the dark sent us its shepherds." The vote was unanimous. That evening Riven sat alone in their quarters, and they had finally found time to go back to the thing that had started all of this. The human broadcast signal they had detected weeks ago that had been dismissed as irrelevant. They sorted through the enormous archive of human music that had been beamed into space, and they found a piece that made them stop and listen, really listen. And it was a song about getting knocked down and getting back up and refusing to stay on the ground no matter how many times you fell. Riven played it again and again, and outside their viewport, the first permanent human embassy was being constructed on Ascendancy Prime. A modest building compared to the grand architecture of the other species, but it flew a blue and green flag that the humans called Earth, and Riven thought it was beautiful. On Asharon, where the fires had finally gone out and the rebuilding had begun, Lieutenant Alina Vasquez sat on the steps of a Thili school that the combat engineers had just finished reconstructing. She was bruised and exhausted and scarred in places that would never fully heal, some on her skin and some deeper. And she sat there in the quiet of a world that was learning to breathe again. A Thili child approached her, small and tentative, and wide-eyed with the kind of cautious curiosity that children have when they are not sure if something is safe, but they want very badly to find out. Vasquez looked at the child and she smiled, and it was a real smile, tired and sad and warm and human, and she held out her hand. The child looked at the hand for a long moment and then reached out and took it, and the child's fingers were delicate and cool against Vasquez's rough, warm palm. They sat together on those steps, the soldier and the child, and neither of them spoke because they did not share a language, but they shared something older and more important than words. Somewhere in the deep black of space, the Vraxith were still running, and behind them, a galaxy that had spent 400 years being afraid, was finally learning what the humans had always known. That the darkness is real, and the monsters are real, and fear is real. But so is the hand that reaches out, and the voice that says, "I am here," and the stubborn, impossible, beautiful refusal to look away when someone needs you. The galaxy had feared monsters. And then they met humans.